Hey nerds, Farmer Jesse here. Welcome to Growers Daily, your daily dose of ecological farming insight. It is Monday, December 2nd, 2024, and today we are discussing overwintering peppers for commercial gardens, late cover cropping, and should farms really just be 3 farms in 3 different regions? Yeah, so let's do it. All right, well, welcome to December, everyone. It's a month famous for one really big and really special holiday here in North America, the winter solstice. That day, December 21st, just can't come fast enough, in my opinion. I dearly, dearly miss my daylight. One production note for this December 2nd is that there will not be a show on Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday of this week, as I will have an event, but I will be back to it the next Monday. Now, could I kill myself to make it work and get something up for you every day this week? Totally. But I would be dead, which doesn't feel like a great trade-off. However, once I get to the point of being able to hire a producer for this show who can come help me here at the farm, those gaps will go away because I will have someone else to help me fill them. In theory, at least. So thanks to everyone who supports us and gets us inch by inch closer to that goal. Anyway, I hope everyone had a nice weekend. We welcomed in some heavy freezes this week, and I say welcomed intentionally because it was, like I mentioned many times, starting to get absurd over here. I needed the pea cover crops to stop creeping out into the pathways. I needed the grass to no longer be tall, so all the random tools and such on the ground can get uncovered, and so I can get them out of the way, which, as I've expressed on many episodes so far, is among the most satisfying of all time farm chores. And it sort of did that Friday night. We got a hard freeze, smashing the peas to the ground, which I'll admit is up there with like rotten onions or brassicas in terms of smell. But then Saturday, we got a couple inches of snow, which, being the amazing insulator that snow is, probably protected some of that stuff that I wanted to die. Oh well, the getting stuff off the ground part of the list will just have to wait. The problem with the winter list is that it never quite gets done anyway, which is fine. The daylight and the cold just slow everything down, and I make an ambitious list every year, but that doesn't mean that I don't like working in the winter. I love how crisp and clean it feels outside in the winter. I love hoodies and jackets and beanies and gloves, but our winters here in Kentucky are not generally white winters. We get snow like that for sure, but it goes away pretty quickly. Winters are mostly just mud season here, where everything is wet and stays wet. I get jealous sometimes of our friends up north, like Small Axe Farm in Vermont, who are always posting videos of their wild ice skating adventures called wild skating or Nordic skating, as in ice skating on lakes and other waterways, which kind of blows my mind. When I was a kid, I grew up snowboarding in Colorado, and so I guess I have an affinity for winter sports in that way, which we don't have many of here in Kentucky. Not a ton you can do with cold mud. It's not the best sports medium. I used to have this idea for farms where every farm should be 3 farms, 1 tropical, 1 temperate, like us, and 1 colder. An example would be maybe a farm in Florida, 1 in Kentucky, conveniently, and 1 in Michigan. And I use all of those because they're all off of I-75. Or not necessarily those 3, just 3 different areas that could all supply each other with things that others can't grow at that time of year. Now, to be clear, I don't think this idea would ever work, or I'm basically inventing grocery stores, but imagine that in the summer, the folks down on the tropical climate farm could take it relatively easy and receive produce to sell from their farm store or through their farm store, which is the key component to this model, from the north and temperate farms. Then in the winter, it's the more temperate and tropical farms that are supplying the furthest north. And then the farmers could have an excuse to drive produce or products from one place to another and take a weekend to enjoy those regions. Maybe ice skating or hockey up north in Michigan in the winter, or surfing in Florida, or perhaps it's going up to a lake in Michigan instead of being down in the heat in the summer in Florida when stuff doesn't grow very well. Kentucky doesn't quite have as much to offer outside, but it does have an amazing and extended fall and spring compared to the others. And horses, we got lots of those. But, maybe it's nice to have a stopping point in the middle. So not only could you supply a lot of what folks in those other areas are buying anyway, shipped in from all over the world at their local grocery store, but it would give the farmers an opportunity to take breaks and work and play in regions different from their own. Now, the complicated logistics of something like that are beyond my brain power and not to mention the startup capital being well beyond any of our means, but the idea is there. For us here in Kentucky, we already see a lot of produce coming up from places like Georgia early in the spring and being sold at our farmers markets, the ones that are not producer only, it would be super cool to be able to tell customers that not only do we know these farms and their practices, where the, for instance, peaches that we're selling come from, but we also helped grow them. Then, of course, the revenue from that would be shared, or it would be based on some sort of consignment. I have no idea. I have friends who sell citrus and avocados from other friends across the country in their farm store, so why not create a more formal pipeline for these things? So yeah, I've invented grocery stores, but like cool ones, and ones that involve surfing and ice skating, maybe within the same week. All right, I will take any and all thoughts you have on that. Maybe there are examples of things that are similar to that. I have no idea. Would love to hear about those, large or small. Otherwise, we'll take a quick break, and when we come back, we will get a question about late cover cropping, BRB. If you, the listener, are enjoying this podcast and would like to support it, you can do so over at patreon.com/no-till-growers. I am honored absolutely every time someone signs up over there, and I try to get questions from everywhere that questions come in, but I will always get to those Patreon questions. Today's question comes from Patreon member Samantha Baker, who writes, quote, "Hi, Farmer Jesse." Hi, Samantha. I've been enjoying the daily show and always make sure to watch or listen to it over lunch. I'm looking for advice on what to do with my empty dahlia beds. I think I would like to sow a cover crop, but I'm unsure what to use. I need to have it terminated by April so I can replant. I'm not opposed to having to till it in, since I'll be digging big holes to replant the dahlias anyway, also clay soil. I also have tarps that can be used. My other option is to just cover with leaves or straw. I'm in Zone 7A, South Central Pennsylvania. Side note for context, I'm overwintering half of my dahlia production beds using Jenny Love's leaf and tarp method. I just wanted increase rootstock for other varieties. So WWJD, which I assume the J here is either Jenny or Jesse or both. All the best, and thanks for dedicating so much time and effort to the show, Sam. End quote. All right, thanks, Sam. So I love this question, and this is really a question about late cover cropping in Zone 7A, which is roughly my same zone. And basically, you have two options for sowing a cover crop later in the season, like now, like late November, early December. The first option is that you can just not sow anything at all, like not sow a cover crop, kind of as you mentioned. Instead, in the beds where there are no dahlia tubers, find some mulch of some sort, like that, straw or whatever you mentioned, that you feel comfortable with, and cover those beds for the season just to keep the soil fed and in place. For those not familiar with the Jenny Love reference Sam makes, Jenny Love is a no-till flower grower, hosts the No-Till Flowers podcast, who overwinters some of her dahlias in the ground, i.e. she does not dig them up in the fall, which is like the typical way flower growers do it. And then they basically dig them up, and then they preserve them over the winter and replant them in the spring. I know that when I went up to help Jenny a couple years back in November, she would cut her dahlia plants down to the ground, lay the plant material on the bed, cover that with leaves several inches thick, and then cover that mulch and everything with impermeable tarps so as not to allow excess moisture. We also did a video about all that called No Dig Dahlias for anyone who is interested, which I will link in the show notes, where she explains why and how she doesn't dig her dahlias. But where you don't have dahlias still in the ground, any mulch that does not contain weed seed should be fine to just hold the bed down over the winter. Straw or leaves or a light compost mulch is all fine. However, in terms of cover crops, the options are somewhat limited. If someone wanted those beds in April and didn't want to till, I would not sow a winter hardy cover crop like rye or vetch or winter wheat or even oats this late. No crimson clover either. Again, you can sow those, but only if you want to till them in the spring. Like Sam mentioned that they were okay with doing, but for many of you who may not want to do that. In that case, a winter hardy mix is fine, but I do want to emphasize that springs are unpredictable and unreliable. Like, it's not always dry enough to get in the ground under a cover crop. in early April. So for that time of year, I might still suggest, instead of a winter hardy cover crop, something like peas and Lacey Facilia that are easier to terminate with just a really low mowing. So you won't likely have to till them in case it's really wet next spring, leaving all those roots intact to help feed the soil and the next crop. Also, I really like those two because they germinate relatively easily in the cold. Another crop that germinates well in the cold and is relatively easy to terminate is spinach. That's an easy crop to grow in the winter. The seed is relatively cheap. I recommend Tundra, which is a Savoyed spinach that handles the cold like a champ. Then that way you have some good winter greens for March that you can terminate fairly easily in the spring. The nice thing about adding peas, though, is the nitrogen fixation, which when you pull a pea root that has been in the ground over the winter and look at the size of the nodules on the roots where the nitrogen fixing bacteria called rhizobium reside, they are enormous little balls on the ends of those roots. Pea roots in general are plentiful and great for soil. So if I was just going to sow a single late cover crop that's easy to deal with, field peas for the win. Anyway, I hope that was helpful, and there is a whole playlist of cover crop videos that I will also link in the show notes that may help you get some good overall advice. Thanks for the question, Sam, and best of luck. Up next, we're going to take a quick break and then talk about overwintering some peppers. Be right back. All right, so I want to catch up on some of our questions this week at the Patreon page because I have started a new Patreon December show thread, or I'm about to, and I still have a lot of November questions to get to, but that doesn't mean I want you to stop those questions from coming in, Patreon members. I want lots of questions. It helps me to come up with topics every day, which is a lot of work, so I appreciate the questions, and I frankly love answering them. I also thought this question might be really relevant to some of you in warmer climates. It comes from Patreon member Amy Blankenship, who writes, quote, "Regular gardening YouTube has loads of videos about overwintering things like peppers. I'm not a market gardener, but I am curious, is there a business case for overwintering plants like these to have really early fruit in the spring?" End quote. And thank you, Amy. This is a fun question. So for a little background here, surprise, peppers can perennialize to some extent, but there are two ways this is possible. The first is that you have to live somewhere warm enough to keep them alive in the field. So basically somewhere it does not freeze at all in the winter, or you can dig them up, prune them down a bit, and keep them indoors under the right conditions until the spring when you just replant them. So basically it becomes a house plant, but without a lot of foliage on it. So in the case of the former, where you do not have to dig them up, simply prune them back again and maybe cover them, I see no reason not to try and keep them alive unless you were dealing with pest and or disease pressure this past season. You will get earlier peppers. You won't have to fiddle with starting them in the late winter indoors. So I say, sure, go nuts. At least try it on a small trial scale and see how it compares to peppers that you start fresh. Though if you are going to try and perennialize them in the field, being the nervous, risk-averse pepper lover that I am, I would probably still start a small batch of replacement peppers this spring in case of disease or pest issues, and I would only attempt the field pepper perennialization if they had a great season the year before. I would also dedicate a good amount of my best compost to those beds to ensure the peppers are happy the next year. Now, for the second option of digging them up and keeping them somewhere over winter and then replanting or repotting the peppers in the spring, that can work, and there are several tutorials online about how to do that. And if you're just growing a handful of pepper plants and the space where you're going to keep them is already established, I say sure, go ahead and dig up a few plants and try to keep them alive over the winter. It could pay off in the spring for a backyard garden for sure. As a commercial grower, however, producing hundreds or for some of you thousands of pepper plants, if I'm in a climate where peppers cannot just simply be overwintered in the field, like the climate I am in, where it just gets too cold, it would be hard to justify pruning them down, digging them up, potting them up individually, and keeping them alive all winter unless you already had ideal conditions that didn't take extra work or money to maintain. And maybe some of you do. If you have examples, I'd love to hear them. For one, your risk of losing pepper plants to disease or pests inside is quite high. So some of that work and labor and materials could be just wasted. The space required for a couple hundred pepper plants is also not nothing. And I don't know about you, but I don't have a few hundred square feet of temperature controlled indoor space for plants. It would probably just end up being a soccer field. So I certainly wish I did. But what I can't find is a cost benefit analysis or comparison trial to understand under the absolute right conditions would the financial benefits of keeping plants alive outcompete the ease of starting new plants every spring. If ease is the right word there. It takes a while, but it's not hard. Now, my assumption here is probably not. It probably wouldn't make sense, but if you had a good space to keep them and enough grow bags or pots or whatever to preserve them in, I don't know. If I hadn't already missed the window on my peppers, which are now fully kaput, I would have tried it for you all, so maybe next year. I would be curious to hear from any commercial growers who have tried overwintering peppers on a large-ish scale indoors, like not in the field. Actually, I guess I'd also be curious to hear if anyone who has done it outdoors on a large scale and how they feel about the production. Otherwise, I'll wrap it up there. Huge shouts to Willie Breeding for the theme music and the team at No Till Growers for their support. I will be back tomorrow, but not Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday. This is the last farm event that should interrupt our hangout time this winter, I think. Also, again, I hope to not have to miss many days in the future, but until I can afford a producer, that won't be entirely possible. This show and the Patreon page is growing quite a bit, though, so we are slowly getting there. If you want to help out, consider signing up over at patreon.com/no-till-growers to support our work where, at a certain level, or if you just bump up from one level to another, or if you sign up in the month of November, you get a huge shout out on the show. So big shout outs today to, who we got? Abigail West, William Potts, Les Malden, Victor Guggenbull. Nailed that one, Victor, I'm sure of it. And Michelle Paget. Little known fact that after Elphaba dies in The Wizard of Oz, there was a group commissioned to study and see if the green pigment in Elphaba's skin was chlorophyll. And this is the group. And the research is not out just yet, but what they wanted to understand was, did her magical powers come from photosynthesis? And I haven't read the paper yet, but I think it's possible. It's possible. Yeah. I mean, it would defy gravity, but yeah. Anyway, thanks for listening or watching. We'll see you tomorrow.